Welcome to Mr. Boogeyman, where every story is a journey into the unknown. If you enjoy the thrill of the eerie and unexplained, consider subscribing for more chilling tales. Grace had always fancied herself an independent woman, but moving to this suburban neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of city life, was a leap into the unknown. At 32, having just come out of a tumultuous relationship, she was ready for a fresh start. The tranquil tree-lined streets and friendly smiles offered her a facade of comfort. Yet something felt amiss, lurking just beneath the surface of this idyllic setting. Her new home, a quaint little cottage, shared a fence with Mr. Henderson's house. He was a fixture in the community, a reclusive elderly man whom hardly anyone seemed to talk about. Grace had made it a point to wave at him, occasionally and politely smile, though their interactions were limited to those brief moments. After a long day at work, Grace often found solace in the routine of cooking or binge-watching her favorite shows. But little did she know that her quiet life was about to unravel. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, Grace's routine was interrupted. Feeling an eerie sensation crawling down her spine, she glanced out her window and spotted Mr. Henderson. He stood in his dimly lit living room, staring intently at her house. The air around her felt thick with unease. How his gaze lingered made her heart race. Maybe he needs help, she thought to herself, trying to suppress her anxious feelings. Perhaps, she reasoned, old habits of worry were flaring up as she settled into her new environment. The next night, the same scene replayed itself. This time, Grace felt the weight of his gaze more acutely, a desperate plea hidden in his intensity. Unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, Grace decided to reach out. After several unsuccessful attempts to call him, the glow of his lights flickered out, leaving an unsettling darkness that enveloped his house. Pushed by an overwhelming concern for her neighbor's well-being, Grace wrapped her scarf around her neck and stepped into the chill of the evening air. She walked over to his front door, heart pounding as she approached the entrance. The door creaked ever so slightly when she pushed it open. It was ajar, almost inviting yet foreboding. Her instinct battled with fear as she crossed the threshold. Stepping inside, an eerie silence greeted her. The living room was barren, no furniture, no family photos to tell a story. It was as if Mr. Henderson had simply vanished into thin air. Panic danced at the edges of her thoughts as she turned to leave, retreating through the door with urgency. The darkness outside seemed to close in around her, shadows stretching as she hurried back home. Once safely inside, Grace's breath hitched in her throat as her phone buzzed violently on the couch. She picked it up and stared in disbelief at the number displayed. It was unfamiliar, and the message was chilling. Leave the neighborhood before it's too late. Her heart raced. Who could be sending her messages like this? The comfort of her home suddenly felt like a cage, and the safety of the night morphed into a haunting reality that she never anticipated. What had she stumbled upon? And why did she feel like she was already caught in a web woven by unseen hands? Determined to understand what happened, Grace started her investigation into Mr. Henderson's disappearance with a mix of resolve and anxiety. She knocked on the doors of a few nearby houses, her heart pounding with each ring of the doorbell. The neighbors responded with suspicious glances, their demeanor oddly guarded.
"Oh, Mr. Henderson? He was a nice old man,"
one woman said dismissively, quickly changing the subject. Grace sensed the undercurrents of fear in their voices. It was as if they were deliberately withholding information. Each polite smile felt like a mask, concealing the truth behind layers of fear and secrecy that seemed palpable in the air. That night, as the darkness began to creep in, Grace received her first true warning. After a long day filled with unanswered questions and worrying glances from her neighbors, she was about to settle in when she noticed something slipped beneath her door. Her heart raced as she bent down, retrieving a folded piece of paper. Opening it, her breath caught in her throat. "Leave!" It read in jagged letters, the urgency of the message seeping into her bones. What truly sent chills down her spine was the familiar handwriting. It matched that of Mr. Henderson's from an old letter she had found in his empty house. Someone knew she was probing into matters best left untouched. Grace refused to be deterred. Instead, she threw herself deeper into her research, her obsession with the neighborhood's dark history intensifying. Days turned into nights spent scrolling through archives, delving into news articles, and speaking with local historians. What she discovered sent shivers down her spine, a pattern of disappearances stretching back for decades, targeting those who had deep roots in the community. Each account was similarly unsettling, residents vanishing without a trace, their stories ending abruptly. Among her findings was an old newspaper article detailing a tragic fire that had consumed a significant part of the neighborhood years ago. Rumors swirled about its origins, pointing fingers at a cult that supposedly haunted the area, conducting dark rituals under the cloak of night. Legends whispered of sacrifices and ceremonies, culminating in the fire that left destruction in its wake. But one mention caught her attention. A lone survivor, a young Mr. Henderson, forever tied to the darkness surrounding this place. The breadcrumbs were lining up, and Grace felt a desperate urgency to piece the stories together before she became another name in the unsettling legacy of disappearances. Grace stood in her dimly lit kitchen, the flickering light bulb overhead casting eerie shadows against the walls. The air felt thick with an unsettling energy, and she could not shake the sensation that eyes were on her, watching from the dark corners of the room. She had tried to dismiss the phenomena as stress-induced hallucinations or the inevitable anxiety that came with her neighbor's disappearance. But the more she investigated, the more the strange occurrences. While sitting at her dining table one evening, she noticed her antique clock striking midnight. At that very moment, a glass slid off the edge and shattered on the floor, sending shards flying. Startled, she froze, heart racing. As she bent down to pick up the pieces, she heard a faint whisper, soft yet urgent, echoing through the stillness of her home.
"Leave before it's too late."
The voice was barely legible, yet it sent a chill down her spine. Her dreams had become restless torment, a series of fragmented scenes that replayed terror night after night. She often awoke drenched in sweat, the images of clawing hands and shadowy figures plaguing her thoughts. But why? Why was she being targeted? The clues twisted in her mind, each one tangling tighter than the last. It was as if an unseen force was holding her captive, teasing her with glimpses of the truth while keeping it just out of reach. Then came the night when the atmosphere shifted inexplicably. As she stared out her window, expecting the usual shadows to dance beneath the streetlights, she saw him, Mr. Henderson. He stood in her yard, his figure illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. But he was different, his once jovial face now missing the warmth of life. He looked ethereal, wispy like smoke caught in the wind. Her breath hitched as her instincts screamed at her to run. Yet she found herself drawn to him, desperation clawing at her heart.
"Grace."
He beckoned softly, his voice echoing as though it came from the depths of a tunnel. She rushed outside, driven by an impulse she couldn't understand. But just as she reached for him, he dissolved into the air, leaving nothing but the cold grass under her feet. Upon returning to her house, a message lit up her phone, pulsating ominously in the darkness. Her hands trembled as she clicked the video link. There was Mr. Henderson, looking more fragile than she had seen him before, his eyes wide with fear.
You need to stop,
he pleaded, urgency pressing into every word.
They're watching you. You must leave before they come for you, too.
The video cut to static, leaving an echo of his warning hanging in the air. Panic gripped Grace, but she knew she couldn't just abandon her investigation. She needed answers. The only way to break free from the malevolent grip of the neighborhood was to confront the darkness head-on. As she frantically searched for clues in old texts and blurred archives at the local library, she stumbled upon a reference to an ancient ritual. It revealed the history of a cult that once thrived in her neighborhood, but their lust for power led to heinous acts, trapping their spirits in the veil between worlds. According to the lore, if she could perform the ritual, she might sever their connection to the living and in turn, free not just herself, but Mr. Henderson and the other lost souls. Grace prepared for what lay ahead, knowing full well the dangers involved, but feeling a fierce determination rising within her. She would find a way to break the curse or die trying. As the dark shadows closed in around her, she steeled herself for the confrontation that felt inevitable, one that could either save her or seal her fate as the next resident of the haunted streets. A thick shroud of unease enveloped Grace. As she stood in her dimly lit living room, the materials for the ritual laid out before her. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, while the air crackled with an otherworldly energy. The determination that had driven her to this moment wavered under the weight of impending dread. She felt eyes upon her, piercing through the ethereal veil. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her resolve to set things right. As she recited the incantation, the temperature in the room plummeted, and suddenly the atmosphere turned electric. The shadows twisted and writhed as the spirits of past victims materialized around her, their faces contorted in anguish, mouths stretched in silent screams.
Stop,
they implored, their voices a haunting chorus that echoed in Grace's mind. But she pressed forward. The house shuddered violently as the spirits launched their assault. They were angry, desperate to prevent their release. Doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the very walls of her home seemed to pulse with fury. In the eye of the storm, Grace felt a flicker of clarity. The pinnacle of terror was approaching. The air turned thick with despair as she held steadfast to her resolve. She had unearthed the truth about Mr. Henderson and his tragic fate. Realizing that he was not merely a victim of circumstance, but the linchpin of the curse binding them all. The weight of their suffering pressed heavily on her heart, but she wouldn't allow fear to cripple her. With a final incantation, the ground beneath her feet groaned, and as the last syllables escaped her lips, energy surged through the room, exploding in a blinding flash. The spirits shrieked, their forms dissipating into wisps of light, swirling chaotically before being pulled toward a condensed dark mass. The anchor, Mr. Henderson's essence, which had held them captive for too long. With clamoring resolve, Grace made her choice. She could feel the weight of their collective pain as she directed her will toward the anchor, understanding that the only way to vanquish their torment was to sacrifice the very essence that tethered them. With trembling hands, she reached out, shattering the anchor into fragmented echoes of despair. The tumultuous energy receded, and silence descended, heavy, eerie and profound. As the last ghostly remnants vanished, Grace staggered back, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. She breathed in the calm, but her heart raced with the remnants of fear. The house was quiet now, but the eerie calm felt like a prelude to something unsettling. Dragging herself to her car, she fled the neighborhood for good, vowing never to return. Just as she crossed the outskirts of town, her phone buzzed with a message, its suddenness making her jump. She paused, reading the words that echoed like a gentle whisper in her mind.
"Thank you. You're free now. We all are."
A chilling shiver ran down her spine, but there was solace too, a flicker of light amidst the darkness.